So what we're about to hike on is North America's northernmost route of that Underground Railroad. So,
and where did these slaves end up settling? Did they go on to Quebec?
Welcome to Hiking MB and welcome to the Tomlinson Lake Hike to Freedom.
50 fugitive slaves who were seeking refuge in northern free states had to go further north because in 1850 the United States, the northern states and the southern states got together and they formed what they called the Compromise Bill of 1850, and it changed several laws. And one of those laws that was changed was the already existing fugitive slave laws. Before 1850, it was illegal for bounty hunters to come to northern free states to hunt, capture, and return fugitive slaves back to the south. So that law that was changed allowed, after 1850, allowed bounty hunters to come to northern states to do that. So that meant that if you were a black fugitive seeking refuge in Vermont or New York or New Hampshire or the state of Maine, you were no longer safe. You had to go further north. So New Brunswick had already abolished slavery about 20 years before that. So New Brunswick, there was places like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Quebec were places where fugitive slaves got back on the Underground Railroad and headed north. So Tomlinson Lake became a landmark back in the mid 1800s because at that time there was no line, no pillars that indicated where that border was. So the lake became a landmark. So fugitive slaves who came to Fort Fairfield to Friends Church, which was a safe house for black fugitives, Tomlinson Lake became that landmark when they left the church and came to Perth-Andover. When they got to the lake, they knew they were free, because we did have slavery here in Canada, and slavery was only abolished 30 years before it was abolished in the United States. So a lot of people think that there was never slavery in Canada. That's actually a misnomer.
Oh.
Yeah. So.
And where did these slaves end up settling? Did they go on to Quebec?
So there were already black settlements established here in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick from different influxes. So we had in 1783 we had the Black Loyalists that came after the Revolution, after the American Revolution. There was about 3,000 of them, and they established black communities. And then we had the black refugees of 1812, and so when black fugitive would have came to New Brunswick, they would have made their way to the St. John River and traveled south down to where there were already communities, or they would have squatted on property. They would have built a little cabin, and then after the Civil War, most of those black fugitives went back to the States. Over 75% of that population went back to the States because there was very little opportunity here for them. Work was limited. There was a lot of racism. The only reason why they came here was to escape bounty hunters. So what brings you up this way, James?
Well, back in the days of the Rustic War, I was in Fort Fairfield area, and I helped the British in that time because the border wasn't settled until 1843, right? So now I'm here to help however I can with the Underground Railroad folk. I don't like thinking much about that, and if I'm not sure.
I thought you talked in town this morning that there was some bounty hunters coming towards the border. Did you hear that?
I had heard a little bit of that, but rumors are rumors. You know, that's why I didn't go any further. I wasn't sure about crossing this bridge. Is that safe to cross?
Oh yeah, that's safe.
Yeah, well, you might
So
be
no bombs under?
you might be in different territory, you know what I mean? So you get there.
So the Underground Railroad was free, but like anything else, that entire movement, you do need some funds to help things like publish newspapers that were pro-abolitionist. So they had different ways. A lot of people were very wealthy. A lot of abolitionists were very wealthy, so they helped support that cause. And so this little plaque here talks about the reverse Underground Railroad. So we actually had, there were people here in Canada and Northern Free States who would capture free blacks and fugitive slaves and smuggle them back to southern states where they were sold back into slavery. So this plaque here talks more specifically about a woman named Patty Cannon, and she was believed to have been born in St. Stephen, New Brunswick, and she was quite notorious for capturing small black children, and selling them to, smuggling them back to the south and selling them into slavery.
Oh,
Yeah, so
everybody hear it?
did you guys hear the shot back there?
Yeah.
Did you? Maybe someone's up here hunting caribou or something. I mean, it is 1850 after all, and there would have been no white-tailed deer at that time. Moose would have been scarce. There were moose, but it was mainly caribou until they became extirpated. And by the early 1900s, there were no more caribou. They had either migrated out of New Brunswick or they were all shot off.
Oh,
Yeah.
because they were interfering with the farmland, were they?
No, well, they were just overhunted
Oh,
and
yeah.
too much clear cutting.
Mm.
So white-tailed deer and caribou generally don't have the same type of habitat, don't live in the same type of environment or habitat. Clear cutting like tall pines and creating smaller brush is more ideal for white-tailed deer,
Oh, okay.
and just the opposite for caribou.
Mm.
So when we clear cut the forest, we're making prime habitat for white-tailed deer and less prime habitat for caribou. But in the 1850s, you wouldn't have seen any white-tailed deer. It would have been mainly caribou.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Whoa.
yeah.
No, ma'am. Just your regular civilian, ma'am. Just your regular civilian. No, we're just keeping an eye out.
Mighty fine of you.
Pardon me, ma'am?
Mighty fine of you.
No, doing our Christian duty.
Mighty fine.
Does anybody here know what a pit house is? So you heard me talk about the Black Loyalists of 1783. After the Revolution, there was 3,000 blacks who'd escaped slavery in the States and fought for the British. So the British lost, not thinking that they were going to lose the Revolution. They didn't think that. No one ever thinks they're going to lose the war.
No.
However, they did. So they were left with over 3,000 blacks that they had promised freedom and farmland to. Well, they could give them their freedom, but they had no farmland to give them. So what they did instead, they brought them to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and dropped them off in the middle of September. Very little supplies. Some had tents, some never. So the only way to survive was to dig a hole in the ground and build a two-sided lean-to over the hole. And that's where they stayed over winter. So if you feel free, if anybody wants to go inside to kind of get an idea of what it would have been like to have been a Black Loyalist in 1783 and 3 years
Small,
later,
Yeah.
opted to
Oh, it
go
opens
to
right up, eh?
Sierra Leone.
Darn, that's what I didn't get.
I know, Chris.
Yeah, just after.
Yeah, oh yeah. No, that's for to clean out the musk out here.
Which clan is that? The Black.
Stewart.
Is it Stewart?
Yeah.
Because I have an old gray Stewart.
Okay. That's the Stewart hunting.
Yeah.
Ooh, that was a workout.
That's a good workout.
I think that one of those twinkles on the right.
Yeah. It needs to be tightened, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think it's going to twinkle off.
Are they over there, you're saying?
Yeah.
It was like brownish grayish. So they're long.
Never seen one that long.
That's a good spot to see a moose,
Oh, look at this big guy. Look at this big guy, Peyton.
What?
He must be like 5, 6
Oh
inches.
yeah, my goodness,
Oh
look
my
at that.
God,
See
it's
that?
big.
By the white stone there?
Imagine
Right by the
having
white
that on your
stone.
It's like a ribbon almost.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, they
Like
swim
a-
up and down.
Like
Should
a
I
snake.
stick something
Yeah,
in and see if
snake.
it'll
Like
attach
an eel.
to it?
Yeah.
Snake, eel, whatever. Whoa. From
Let's see if he'll sense.